Pero good morning, everyone. Welcome to not so cold DC. Hopefully, we'll keep moving up and up for the next few days, not weeks. Well, we're pleased to have two colleagues visiting us and talking a little bit about Central American migration. As you know, in the past 2 weeks, the current administration has issued some policies and statements about immigration and reducing migration, particularly of Central Americans, from sending the National Guard to the border to deal with the catch and release approach, as well as to increasing to expedite the cases of asylum adjudications and other cases on their backlog in the administration. And to some extent, these issues don't seem to be in convergence, or they seem to be in contrast with some realities that are taking place with regards to Central American migration. On one hand, well, you have this approach based on the argument that there is a massive influx of people coming from Central America. What we see in practical terms is that since 2009, on the post-recession period, migration of Central Americans has actually not grown that much. Our estimate is that there is a growth in the past 8 years of about 1% of the number of migrants from Central America in the US. Another issue of contrast relates to the people who are actually leaving. We estimate that somewhere around 100,000 Central Americans enter the US through the border every year since 2009. While that is happening, the causes that had led to the people to migrate haven't changed pretty much, even despite commitments from Central American governments to address immigration out-migration of Central Americans, whether by committing to the Alliance for Prosperity, for example. The fact is that the people who are leaving are still arguing that they left out of insecurity. The pattern of insecurity in Central America hasn't changed very much. There's been a 10% decline of homicides between 2016 and 2017. That means that the homicide rate dropped from 14 homicides a day to 12. So the reality is still that there is a serious problem of violence. We find in our work that there is a strong correlation between out-migration from the municipalities and homicide rates in those municipalities. And that is more pronounced in Guatemala and in Honduras. So the pattern of the relationship between migration and violence exists. In our surveys in 2016 and 2017, at least 20% of migrants who came here on the same year say that the reason they left was because of insecurity, personal safety. And then there is also other issues that go somewhat in contrast with efforts in Central America to reduce migration. The approach to economic growth hasn't changed very much. People still continue to live on $200 a month, and there hasn't been really a big shift since the commitment on the Alliance for Prosperity in 2014. 4 years later, the situation is still pretty much the same in terms of economic dynamics. And in fact, for El Salvador and Honduras, practically most of the economic growth that these countries had is exclusively attributed to the growth in remittance transfers to these countries. For example, the growth of remittances to El Salvador equal to $600 million more entering into the country, which is the exact amount of the economic growth that El Salvador had in that year. The same thing is observed in the case of Honduras. And something similar happens with Guatemala. Now, there is another reality that we also somewhat don't see very much, and is that with a 4% unemployment rate in the United States, the demand for foreign labor is real and is demonstrated in different levels. One of them is construction. 4% of the labor force in the US works in construction, but nearly half of those people working in that sector are predominantly foreign workers. The demand is incredibly high. It's also, there is a demand in domestic work and in the caring of the elderly and children. And that is a demand supplied predominantly by foreign workers too. So we have these somewhat contrasting realities. Anti-immigration policies aimed at reducing an alleged influx of migration, massive influx of migration, with declining migration. And whenever there is some migration, it's actually occurring for somewhat legitimate factors. So we wanted to have a discussion, a conversation over these issues, and we have Kristen Leonetti from the Jesuit Conference for Canada and the United States. She works on the social justice program for Central America, and Oscar Chacon, who heads Alianza Americas, which is an organization that works with Latino migrants in the United States. So my question is, well, how do we make sense of these realities, of these contrasting factors? Are people really impervious about what's going on, especially in countries like Honduras, when you have serious problems of political crisis since basically 2009 with the military coup, to the most recent political crisis of the legitimacy of the elections of the current president. And Oscar, how migrants are really, understanding and interpreting these issues. In our latest survey, we learned that the reason why there was a substantive increase in remittances was because migrants were afraid they were going to be deported. And so the increase is not because more migrants came in, it was because people were really freaked out and they tried to send as much as they could in the event of being deported. So welcome, and please, Christine.
Start us off. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Manuel, for the invitation to be here, and to all for the opportunity to talk about these important concerns. As Manuel had mentioned, I work with the Jesuits here in the United States and Canada, but we also work with a network of Jesuit institutions throughout the region, from Central America up through the US and through Canada. Universities, schools, parishes, organizations that serve migrants, that research the causes and the impacts of migration, and that advocate for policies that will honor the dignity of migrants in the region. We believe that people have the right to live and to thrive and to reach their potential in their home countries, and that when that right is not afforded, they also have the right to migrate. And so I think what I'd like to do is to offer a little bit of perspective from that of our partners in the region that are encountering people who are on the margins, who have been affected by displacement internally within their countries and internationally. And maybe I would just start by saying, there's a researcher at one of our partner organizations who tells of what he considers kind of an anecdotal, a pattern of stories that he's heard in his research of interviews with youth, young migrants from the region, in which he says basically he's hearing they have a better chance of being shot in the head than of finding a decent job in their neighborhoods. Right? So this is a story that he's heard repeated again and again, and which does not reflect a reality or this vision of well-being and livelihood in places of origin. I would say, I think we're aware that there are extraordinarily high levels of violence in particularly the Northern Triangle countries, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. I would say that they are connected to, that they reflect a broader model of exclusion in various senses, economically, politically, socially, environmentally, in which there are individuals and components of society that have power, that have access to resources, and there are others that are left on the margins. And that's part of what we see, I think, reflected in the high levels of violence, and violence that takes on different forms. The homicide rates, Manuel has mentioned, they're well above what is considered to be an epidemic by the United Nations, by the World Health Organization. In these countries, being a young person is considered a risk factor. Right? In a 2017 report by Save the Children, Honduras unfortunately came out as the country with the highest homicide rate for children, at 10 times the global average. We also know that it's one of the most dangerous places to be an environmental activist. We know that there are some of the highest rates of sexual and gender-based violence. We have seen reports of concerns of extrajudicial killings and violations of human rights by the state's own security forces. I think it's important to know, in the experience of our partners, that the experience of people who encounter violence is unique and is nuanced and is different for different components. So it's not the same experience, for example, for a young person to be recruited by or to be asked to help a gang or a young woman who has the bad luck of being liked by a gang leader, for example, as a farmer who is defending his territory, his land, his loss of land, or a taxi driver or a bus driver who's being extorted or threatened to be killed for not paying the tax to go into a certain territory. Protesters who are being retaliated against. That's a different experience. And in some cases, we see there are overlaps of these factors. I would share just recently, our partners at the Kino Border Initiative in Nogales, Arizona, and Nogales, Sonora, accompanied a young person and his mom who actually traveled in part with the caravan that was making its way north. They broke off from that group. But the experience of Jose was that he dropped out of school in the 8th grade because he was being pressured to join a gang. He was being recruited. He also experienced domestic violence and physical threats to his physical well-being by his stepfather. At the same time, Jose's cousin was involved in protests in the current political recent political situation with the elections in Honduras. His cousin was killed, and his family has since feared other implications against their well-being as a result. And so you see this as an example of someone who has experienced these types of violence in multiple ways. And as he speaks about it, part of what we hear is concern and a blurring of who the persecutor is. Right? In the case of Jose, the death of his cousin, he wasn't sure if it was security forces or if it were gangs that killed his cousin. When he was pressured to join a gang, he reported not going to the police because of high levels of corruption and the complicity of security forces with the gangs. And so we see, I think, a blurring of lines between who is it that is persecuting and who is it that is involved in some of this violence. I share this to say I think part of what is reflected here is the failure of states to provide the conditions where people can thrive in their home countries. In the face of instability and violence, also a failure to provide protection for individuals who are experiencing violence, and in some cases, state actors who are complicit in and are perpetuating those levels of violence. I mentioned the recent elections in Manuel. Mentioned the recent presidential elections that took place in Honduras in November of 2017, and that's a situation that we've been following with great concern. As you may be aware, it was a widely disputed elections. The OAS itself called for new elections as a result of irregularities in that process and inability to speak to the credibility and validity of the results of those elections. And we were highly concerned that when the population turned out in masses to protest what certainly appeared to be fraudulent elections, they were met with widespread repression by state security forces. Our partners in Honduras, Radio Progreso and what's called rhetoric, with their partners as well in country, have documented over 30 cases of individuals who were killed in this situation. These concerns were similarly echoed in a recent report from the UN's Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights in Honduras, where they report mass and indiscriminate arrests during the curfew and state of emergency that the government declared, in addition to the deaths, majority by state security forces and the military police, and many more that were wounded. I actually had the opportunity to visit our partners in Honduras at the end of January, and I will say that I was really struck, I think, by the stories of individuals that we met who were impacted directly by this violence of military, of police, of state security forces, people whose lives will be forever changed. People who now have physical disabilities, mental disabilities that have resulted from the levels of violence. Their families' lives will forever be changed. And one of the things I was really surprised, or I don't know if surprised, but I think that really struck me was people saying, I didn't necessarily have a party affiliation. I didn't vote, and were caught in the crossfire of the levels of violence, or even though they didn't vote, saw what seemed to be such blatant fraud and decided to join in protests, and were affected by this repression of these forces. I guess the other thing that I would like to mention is that, again, I think these are not one-time occurrences, but have a history, and there's been a pattern that is these models of exclusion, right, in which, in Honduras, we've been hearing this for some time, there is a closing of the space in which voices of opposition to those in power can be expressed and can be heard and can be respected. We would consider this fundamental, a fundamental human right and a fundamental element of democracy, and it's something that we don't see, and our partners have been directly impacted by that. We've had partners whose lives have been threatened as a result of speaking out in these situations, and we know that those that they accompany in communities are similarly threatened with an absence of visibility. And so, I think these are the realities that we see reflected in migration, in the face of migration. And I think we should be cognizant that it's not just individuals coming to the United States, but we have seen significant increases throughout the region in people that are seeking international protection in other countries. Costa Rica has seen a significant increase in asylum applications from El Salvador, for example, in 2017. Mexico has seen similarly significant increases in recent years, more than doubled the number of asylum applications from 2015 to 2016, nearly doubled again from 2016 to 2017. And this is a reflection of the situation in which people are living and are not finding a space that they can be safe. So that's what I would offer, I think, to start in terms of what we are hearing reflected back.
Well, that's quite a lot of input in there. Oscar.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's good to be back at the dialogue. Thank you, Manuel, for organizing this event this morning. I don't disagree with anything that has been said. I think it's a very accurate portrayal of the current state of affairs. I would just perhaps say a little bit differently some of the same things, which I think is important to keep in mind. From a structural, long-standing point of view, the problem in Central America has been, not in recent years, but for decades, an economic system that fails to provide opportunity to the majority of their citizens. And I don't mean just jobs, because jobs get to be created to some degree, not enough, by far. But even the jobs that are created don't allow people to earn a living that allow them to raise a family, in a way that is dignified. And so that's the long-standing problem that we have had. Take the case of El Salvador. El Salvador produces, on a yearly basis, roughly 23,000, 24,000 jobs. But about 110,000 people enter the labor market on a yearly basis. So same pattern, replicates in Honduras, in Guatemala. We are just not able, to produce with the economic systems in place any capacity to really absorb, the basic expectation of a dignified way of life, in these countries. The second factor that I think it's important is the continuing reality of violence. If you go back to the 1980s, or prior to the 1980s, there was really not that much Central American migration to the US. And interestingly, prior to 1980, it was not a reality that you could explain by saying that there was no poverty in Central America. There was a lot of poverty prior to 1980, except, that people didn't know that there were options outside the country to go seek. Those options became more obvious, throughout the 1980s. But what triggered massive exodus of people from different countries were political instability in each of the countries. Wars, in at least 3 of the countries there. And interestingly, that pattern is one we have not overcome. These moments of violence continue to happen. It is a very different kind of violence today than it was in the 1980s. as Kristen pointed out, part of the problem nowadays is you don't know who's going to hit you. Back in the 80s, it was more predictable who was going to hit you. Nowadays, it's much harder to really know. But we do know, for example, that whenever there is an outburst of political violence, more migration will follow. That we know. We've seen enough, from this region to know, for example, that what we are seeing in Honduras is only the beginning of a wave that is likely to be intensified, in the years to come. Which is why I believe President Trump went out so publicly, about this caravan that was transiting through Mexico, because he knows, the people advising him know enough to know that because of what happened in Honduras, there will be more people from Honduras trying to make their way out. I was speaking to somebody that we actually met, because I was in the same trip with Kristen in late January in Honduras. And this guy was telling me that he hasn't had a job for the last couple of months, because he is known to many people as one who protested, the presidential elections outcome, and he wouldn't be hired anywhere. And so chances are that we are going to see more people from Honduras trying to leave. The third element that I want to also point is one that Manuel referenced already. And it is the fact that in spite of all the talk about illegality and law breaking and people crossing borders without permission, the truth of the matter is that when you look back over the last 3-4 decades, the labor market, when it comes to the US, Mexico, Central America, and Caribbean countries, in a practical manner, it is already an integrated labor market. Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean have been the primary sources of workers we needed in the US. And we continue to need, in the US, especially not only because of the macroeconomic indicators that we all know about, unemployment rate, the growth of the US economy, but also demographics. The bottom line is the US labor force, native-born labor force, is becoming older and older. And every day, 10,000 people reach age 65. That means that we need to replenish the labor force. But here is the question. Is it really a matter of wanting to stop flows? Or is it a matter of finding ways of cheapening even more, the cost of labor force? You may have seen this morning the New York Times. There is an interesting article about how under this administration, they are really cracking on people who have been beneficiaries of legal permanent residency petitions. Even people who married US citizens. But because sometime in the past, they face some sort of immigration violation, at the same time that they come in to interview, for the legal permanent residency application, they are caught, by the immigration police, known as ICE. So it doesn't really make sense if you think more broadly. Chances are we are going to need more people, to fulfill roles in the kind of economy that we have. Chances are that those workers are not going to come from Norway. Those workers are likely to be coming still, from Mexico, Central American countries, and the Caribbean, except that we want them to be available to us at the cheapest possible cost. And you may even know that there is a process underway at the UN level, a process known as the Global Compact on Migration. And interestingly, that Global Compact is supposed to be all about making migration safe, regular, and orderly. But in reality, I think that process, even though the US has officially pulled out, from that process, I think that the real pathway that they are looking at is a pathway where we actually have more people migrate, except that we have them either as outright not authorized or illegal, as it is the preferred word in the US, or we bring them under temporary visas that allow employers to be even more exploitative officially. Because they wouldn't be exploiting an illegal labor force, they would be exploiting a legal labor force, except that they are by design temporary. And I'm not talking about science fiction. All you need to do is go to the Gulf countries, in the Middle East, to get a picture about what I'm talking about. And so I think in the end, Central American migration, and for the time being, Mexico is not so much in the picture because we love to think that there is no more migration from Mexico. I assure you there are still a lot of people coming from Mexico. It's just that, when you add the people coming in and then you subtract the people being deported, then you get to the so-called zero migration argument. But the reality is there is a lot of people still coming in. I mean, I see people all the time where I live, near Chicago, just landing a new job, and they just arrived from Mexico. So migration is still happening. But the question is, under what rights? And this is the last comment I'll say to begin this segment, at least. I fear that Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean, for us, for the United States of America, represent the very specific, tangible example of what may well be a significant backtracking on the question of universal rights. Up until recently, we have assumed that if somebody is working in this country, it doesn't matter if they have a visa or they don't, they are still entitled to exercise labor rights that are universally applied. But the pathway we seem to be going into is one where we will essentially bring up a division between those who are authorized for employment and what rights they have available versus those who are here on a temporary visa and what rights they have available. And then come the people who are outright not authorized. And we seem to be moving in a direction where we seem to be preparing for essentially denying all rights to the latter. And I'm afraid that that is what's ultimately at stake, when it comes to Central American, Mexican, Caribbean migration to the U.S.
Thank you, Oscar. Let's have some questions and answers on this segment. Definitely, we do see in our estimates of migration from Mexico, we see at least last year, at least 70,000 people enter through the border. So there is still a pattern, and some of it is connected to problems, the political dynamics going on in the region. So to some extent, one might wonder what would be a fair approach, or what will constitute a commensurable approach both to what's going on in Central America as well as to migration policy, especially that we are somewhat engaged in an immigration debate, even though no one wants to call it an immigration debate. We've been pushed in that direction on a very narrow scope, extremely narrow scope, but we are in that space. So let me open the floor for questions from you.
Thank you both very much.
And from where you're coming from.
Hi, I'm Danielle from the International Republican Institute. Thank you very much, all of you, for your comments. My question would be, what role do you see the U.S. playing in addressing the push factors? So that could either be through diplomacy, foreign aid, however you might see that role. Thank you.
Let's take two more questions. One here, and Anita.
Brian Roberts. My question is, there's clearly substantial variance inside each Northern Triangle country in terms of levels of violence, homicides, et cetera. How much internal migration has there been inside the countries by people seeking to get to less violent places?
Hi, hi, Anita Isaacs, Haverford College and the Inter-American Foundation. Some of my questions sort of bounce off the ones that have been asked, but let me ask a slightly sort of different one and ask practically. We talk about, you guys have both talked about economic and social and political exclusion. We talked about patterns of economic growth that haven't changed. We've talked about an alliance for prosperity that is midway through. And I'm sort of, one of the things that I've been trying to do is think quite practically about how one changes these models, rather than the big questions. I write a lot about dumping on the private sector. I write a lot about doing all kinds of things, but I'm in a position where right now I'm trying to think quite practically about programs and initiatives that might be able actually to shift that kind of exclusionary model, or sort of what you've described as the pull factors of migration. And I wonder whether we could get down to practicalities and think about examples or instances that might actually move that needle so that the Alliance for Prosperity isn't yet another waste of resources.
We have.
Okay, hello, my name is Sol and I am from the Embassy of Costa Rica. Nowadays, migrants cite violence and insecurity as their reasons for leaving their country. Yesterday, Costa Rica granted asylum to a Honduran student accused of rioting in post-elections protests. And as you know, during the Obama administration, Costa Rica signed a protection transfer agreement. I would like to know the status of this agreement and the utility. I know this agreement is for refugees, but I would like to know, how do you see the trends for refugees, the asylum seekers, for the Central Americans trying to go to the U.S.? So this is my question.
Thank you. I remember we had Luis Guillermo Solis coming to talk about the agreement. I think it was to host about 1,000 asylum applications, right, for refugee applications to Costa Rica. So should we start with that, or with?
I can share some comments, especially in terms of, what are we as a country doing, trying to address, the so-called root causes of what makes people leave. I think that there are, I like to call them isolated efforts, that are being funded actually by USAID, that have the potential, if they were to become not isolated projects, but more of a coherent, policy. I think that there are some lights of hope. Yet, I think that when I hear top U.S. State Department officials say that the U.S. policy in Central America is to prevent people from migrating, that's very concerning. Because if the purpose of the intervention is to deny the right, for people to seek a better opportunity for them and their families, that's a problem. I think we need to acknowledge that even if we were to have the best policy, best of intentions, it is not going to pay off tomorrow. Investing in what makes sense now will render benefits several years down the road. And in the meantime, we still need to address the question of the deeply intertwined relationship that exists already between these countries in Central America and the U.S. I don't know how many of you travel frequently to the region. I happen to visit quite frequently. And if you miss your flight, you're going to be in trouble because you're not going to find a seat available, anytime soon. Why? Because every single plane coming from these countries is packed, coming back to the U.S. And those are people with visas. Okay, I'm not talking about people crossing the border illegally because they weren't able to get a visa. So my point essentially is, I am very grateful, for example, to Costa Rica. I'm very grateful to Uruguay. I'm very grateful to other countries that are opening up, themselves to accommodate some of the people that are leaving, not just because they couldn't land a job or a good paying job in El Salvador, but because their lives, are at risk. They could be literally dead, if they stay longer in El Salvador. But the reality is, most people don't want to go, to Costa Rica or to Uruguay or Europe, for that matter. Why? Because people have relatives in the U.S., and that family connection is so incredibly important. And we basically want to deny, that is what's going on. And I also believe that, we love to make these differentiations that to me oftentimes are very intellectual, academic differentiations, between who's an asylum seeker, who's a candidate for refugee status, who's a migrant. In practical terms, on a daily basis, most people don't know how to differentiate. What are they? They probably are all of it, but we have these systems, that only seem to prioritize if you say that you are basically seeking asylum, completely ignoring the fact that there were economic reasons behind that as well. So, and on the question of what are we to do practically, today, I already mentioned, I think that there are projects, in Honduras, in Guatemala, in El Salvador. The problem is the projects I'm referring to are small projects compared to the budgets, that are being spent in Central America. I remember, a year ago or so, me and a few other colleagues were meeting with the State Department Central America director, and he was saying to us, look, we've given a lot of money to Central America. He began doing the numbers, and it was a substantial amount of money, over $2 billion over the last 4 fiscal years. Not all of that money is even spent yet. But when you look at the good projects I was referring to, and the dialogue is involving one such a project, as a matter of fact, Catholic Relief Services is involved in some of those interesting projects. They're tiny compared to the entire amount of money, that is being spent there, which is basically my money and your money, being spent there. And so I think that if we have any hope to actually grasp this in a very practical manner, we would need to make those rather isolated anomalies more the rule, in terms of what needs to be happening in this country. So, and I think that that's an opportunity for people like us in the U.S., and that's what my organization tries to do, to get more Central American who happen to be U.S. taxpayers to actually hold our State Department and our Congress accountable about what are they spending our money in, when it comes to our countries of origin. Because again, there are many things that should be being done. Not all of them, are actually being done. And I'm sure I left something out, but I'll shut up now because I talked too much already.
Kristen?
I would echo, I think, a lot of what Oscar says. I completely agree that I think there is some very positive programming that is taking place in Central America. I previously had the opportunity to work on one a few years back in El Salvador that provided programming to young people, particularly in violent communities, and as pathways out of violence. It's a fraction of what we're spending in the region, and it only provides services and opportunities to certain communities within countries that are clearly dealing with this at a different scale, right? In terms of U.S. role and policy more broadly, I think we would say it really requires a comprehensive approach that is going to address corruption, that is going to address impunity, that is going to address judicial systems, that is going to open more opportunities for these types of programs that are community-based and community-consulted. We would like to see a more active role for civil society in determining the types of responses that are taking place. The other thing I think I would note is the investments of these governments over recent years. Disproportionately, there have been investments by the Northern Triangle governments in security versus health and education. And so how do we expect to improve well-being of people in countries when we are only investing more and more in forces that have shown to be repressive, right? And what we see from the US is support of that structure, increasing insecurity, and a fraction that goes to these social programs to help address the real roots of the problems. So, and I think that would be one of our recommendations from our network. I guess in terms of the PTA, I think we were really encouraged to see that avenue open. One of the concerns that we have is the limited scope of it, the fact that it only allows for 200 individuals, is my understanding, it's an important step, and yet the scope of the need is so much greater, right? That's why we were also disappointed to see that the Trump administration made the decision to eliminate the Central American Minors Program, right? This was the other alternative route that existed that would have created an avenue for more safe, orderly, regular migration that was eliminated. And so when some of these avenues are taken away, I think what we see is increasingly vulnerable routes that people take. It's not that they're not aware of the dangers they'll encounter on their journey. It's that the alternative isn't better. There isn't really an alternative, right? Yeah, I think that's...
There was one question about internal displacement. I forgot to mention quickly, it is a problem. You know, whether you are in El Salvador, in Guatemala, or in Honduras, there is a problem with internal displacement. Some countries acknowledge it, recognize it, but don't do much about it. And then you have the case of El Salvador, where they don't recognize that there is a problem with internal displacement, because they were, going back 2-3 years ago, of the opinion that if they recognize that there was internal displacement, that somehow was going to translate in a portrayal of the Salvadorian government as a failed state, and that they needed to protect themselves from what they believed was going to be an attack, by the right wing. Well, elections took place on the 4th of March, and the official party was wiped out. I mean, they lost big time, in this election. And so in retrospective, I would argue that not recognizing that there is internal displacement is simply not the way to go. I mean, I think it needs to be recognized, it needs to be acknowledged. And in a country as small as El Salvador, it's very hard, to pretend that if you move from the eastern part of El Salvador to San Salvador, that somehow you're safe. Because it's such a tiny country, I mean, that is virtually impossible. If you are already under attack by some sort of violent criminal enterprise, it doesn't matter where you go. You're still going to be heavily, at risk. And again, I mean, just to echo what Kristen was saying, the more we close avenues for people to exercise the right to move in an authorized manner, the more people will still do it, but they will do it doing it in any way they can do it, which is often illegal.
Yes, there is actually in Central America some debate, not debate, it's somewhat of a discussion about how much displacement is taking place internally. And it has arise especially in Honduras, of some people living near the department, near San Pedro Sula. But there is not a number. And I think part of the issue is that there is internal mobility going on that is somewhat temporary while they come here. Some people are moving from the residence to another location for the next 3 or 6 months while they move into the United States. They cross the border. But the numbers are not clear. I don't know about Guatemala, what's happening in that regard, but there are some NGOs that are starting to argue that there is a problem of displacement. Just to touch on the question about practical solutions and the role of the U.S., I take to think that the U.S. does have and has played a positive role in regards to addressing some of the problems of Central America. The region, since basically the Caribbean Basin Initiative, has received more than $80 billion in foreign aid, nearly half of which comes from the United States. But it's that the approach perhaps hasn't been exactly the correct one. And right now, for example, when you look at the Alliance for Prosperity and the focus on development strategies, the focus is increase economic growth, makes sense, address political reforms, makes sense, deal with insecurity, makes sense, and focus on education and the return migration. Security, well, the El Salvador, in Honduras, and perhaps the question is to what extent does community policing addresses the severity of the human rights violations that are taking place or the impunity that goes on in those places? And the answer is obviously no. Isn't there a better way to think of this in terms of a transitional justice program and addressing issues like amnesty for many of these individuals that perpetrate crimes in exchange of different things? We did it during the Truth Commissions in the 1980s. When you look at the issue of return migration, the emphasis has been on creating micro-enterprise programs. Well, Central America is the textbook case on the problem of informality. It's a region where 70% of the labor force and its private sector works in the informal economy in saturated markets that don't generate more than 2 minimum wages of wealth, of income. Not income, of wealth, of revenue. So income is less than 1 minimum wage in the end. So there is no convergence. In that regard, I think I think the term practical doesn't fit in the discussion because you have to problematize basically these premises by reaching a new consensus on the one hand and increasing the risk propensity to invest in economies of scale, in human capital. And that's not something that you can do in practical terms in the short term. In practical terms, the question is whether you want to have a short-term approach by complementing these issues, then there are possible ways to do that. And getting certain institutions in the market to do so, it's an alternative. One is the financial sector. The financial sector is not very involved in economic development in the region, other than providing credit. And you may think that credit makes a major contribution, but credit access in Central America is really scarce, especially for small producers and small businesses. So one has to think of how to make a short-term reform, for example, practical approaches to the Community Reinvestment Act that we have in the US to work in the region. So there are ways to look at this, but I think perhaps the issue is not practical, but more strategic in gearing towards a debate in that direction. In my experience, nothing practical that has come across in the past 15 years has actually yielded positive solutions. the United States and the Inter-American Development Bank came within 2 months of the so-called surge of migration of unaccompanied minors in September 2014 with the Alliance for Prosperity. It was a practical solution, $700 million, $600 million. We just have approved another $600 million in foreign aid to the region, but the practical solution doesn't seem to be working. So I took a lot more time than I wanted to. So we have time for more questions. We have a question, a very good question from the audience in the net. The question is, which key actor or institution would you say is currently the least leveraged and poised to make a game-changing contribution? This is a very good question because I think I have been thinking in practical terms that your best partner right now for economic growth and development is the private sector. But yesterday in Guatemala, I don't know if you saw the news of what happened with the involvement of the leaders of the private sector in that country funding illicit activities for the current political ruling party. So, it's like, who is the least leveraged to make a contribution, a game-changing contribution? But we also have more space for questions from you.
Hi, everyone. Hi. Yeah. My name is Paulina Ortega. I'm a Mexican student at the Georgetown University in the Master of Foreign Service. And my question is that, in the one hand, we know that the causes of out-migration from Central America are structural problems. That said, out-migration is going to continue to happen. And in the other hand, we have seen that the response of the government of the United States of America is not friendly towards refugees or migrants coming from Central America. That said, I want to focus on Mexico and ask whether or not you envision a response or a new strategy of the government of Mexico to give a response to this crisis, acknowledging this crisis, and increase the number or its capacity to accept refugees, as they did in the civil war with Guatemala before.
Another question?
According of what she said, I see that there is the trends of the return migration, and we talk about what other countries are doing, what the U.S. is doing about to attend this problem. But what does the triangle, the Northern Triangle countries are doing? What are the strategies they are doing to attend the return migration? I mean, the national programs to attend the migrant mother children who has been deported, and the temporary shelters. There are enough temporary shelters to attend these. There are strategies to locate these people to the urban or to the rural zones. How they are going to manage this, because the return migration is going to continue in the future. So I think the countries needs to have strategies to attend this, or cooperation with another countries. For example, the prosperity plan, the prosperity plan fund. I don't know the utility of these, if it has been a good point or not. And the efforts, at least I know the efforts of the Honduras. I lived there for 13 years, and I know they're increasingly working on programs to attend all the migrants, the people that are deported to go to Honduras again. And, because these people left their countries and they really don't know their countries. So I think it's something that the countries needs to attend also.
Two more questions here.
Hi, good morning. Jimmy McDonough from the Buffett Foundation. I have two questions. First, do the panelists have any recommendations of how our United States Congress can get better informed and have more realistic expectations about the need for development and long-term development in Central America? And then second, do you have any thoughts about the status of regional integration mechanisms, that the SICA, the the free trade areas? What's the status? Are those helpful initiatives?
Hi, it's me again. I just wanted to add to the issue of deportation and to highlight something that, I'm not sure how we bring this to the attention, but it also changes the equation. It's an observation, which is that the process of deportation is actually creating new problems and new responsibilities for the U.S. because we're creating binational communities in these countries, and there are a lot of U.S. residents who are returning on a part-time or permanent basis with their family members who are being deported. And my question is it's not a question, it's an observation that I want to put out there, that when we think about deportation, we also need to think about the creation of new binational communities, both in terms of people who have grown up here and have returned, but also Americans who are now returning, which are creating a burden and responsibility for the United States and these countries that we haven't seen before.
Christine?
I guess we're supposed to be done by 10:30, right? Hardly we will answer all these questions or comments. I'll pick a few, and I'm sure that Kristen will pick others. On the question of who's the most under-leveraged actor, I believe that if you follow the money, the most under-leveraged actor is actually the nationals residing abroad. They are the people who are by far bankrolling Central American countries, but there is nothing that I can possibly call strategy, on how to leverage their nationals abroad. And let me give you one simple example. If I happen to be somebody who's resided in the U.S. for the past 20 years, and I want to go and open a bank account in El Salvador, I cannot do it. It's impossible. The requirements are so incredibly crazy that I cannot even open a bank account, in El Salvador. So that's how bad and underdeveloped, to put it nicely, we are, when it comes to evolving or evolution, if you want, of overall systems. I also agree with Manuel that the private sector is perhaps an under-leveraged actor. The problem I see with the private sector is that they have become very lazy. From their point of view, they don't have to do anything, and they get $12 to $15 billion a year coming in. When you add up remittances in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. So without doing nothing, they get this massive influx of money, which is essentially, it's, taken advantage by them. And I think that I haven't yet heard anybody from the private sector really articulating a visionary perspective. I don't want to call it nationalistic because I really don't believe in nationalism as a way out of this problem, but at least as a vision that acknowledges the fact that Central American countries do have assets in relationship to what the U.S. cares about. And there should be at least some level of regional positioning, in the context of a grand bargain, if you want, with the U.S. And this leads me also to Mexico. Because frankly, I think the role of Mexico, especially since 2014 until now, has been extremely docile to whatever the U.S. want them to do. The U.S. want them to stop people from coming in. They deploy Plan Frontera Sur, in Mexico. Just recently, Trump complained about this caravan. They immediately crack down, on this particular caravan. So Mexico is also part of the problem, and honestly, I don't doubt that many Salvadorians or Hondurans or Guatemalans would like to actually perhaps make Mexico their new home. But I go back to what I said earlier. The personal family connection is far, far stronger with the U.S. than it is, with Mexico. And to me, it is simply the lack of an adequate regional strategy to actually envision a way in which there could be a somewhat, smarter negotiation between these countries and the U.S. and Canada and Europe, because they all could be part of a larger, strategy if there was indeed wise, visionary leadership coming out, from our own countries. Now, there is an election coming up in Mexico. We'll see what happens. But I'm not very, very hopeful that even if there is an unthinkable change for many, meaning that Andrés Manuel López Obrador may get elected as the next president of Mexico, that necessarily will mean something different, just to be perfectly honest. I also believe that there are ways in which our policymakers could get a better handle, on what's going on. The problem is we don't do enough of it. And what I'm thinking about specifically is if members of Congress, especially those serving in the foreign relations committees, were actively seeking to become better informed about what goes on there, above and beyond an agenda that would be defined by the U.S. Embassy in each of the countries. If they were actively engaging civil society actors, some of those actors that are actually behind some of the anomaly projects that I was referring to in terms of U.S. foreign aid, then they may be able to understand a little better what could we be doing, with U.S. taxpayers' money in the region. And so, the last comment I'll make is about regional bodies. Frankly, regional bodies like SICA or the Banco Centroamericano de Integración Económica and others, they're very dependent on national leadership. So if there is no strong national leadership coming from Honduras, from Guatemala, from El Salvador, even from Costa Rica, then let's not expect miracles, from the regional bodies. It requires for it to be something where from each country there should be more at stake. And I'll go back to something I said earlier, these negotiations around the Global Compact on Migration. If you really understand how important migration is for these countries, you would expect Central American countries and Mexico playing a far more smart, visionary role in these global negotiations. I've been actually happy to hear every now and then the Costa Rican, representative in the UN making really interesting, thoughtful comments, but very often what you hear is silence, from these countries, and that's to be regretted. Because there should be more initiative by countries in Central America and Mexico in as far as how to redefine our role in this region. Because whether you like it or not, even the most anti-immigrant people in the U.S. cannot deny the fact we are, for better or for worse, deeply intertwined when it comes to the U.S., Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. You could wish all you want about the Norwegians coming, but it ain't going to happen.
Yes, I like that. I guess a couple of thoughts. One is just to say, because of how interwoven we are, I don't think we can talk about foreign policy without also thinking about domestic immigration policy. So, for example, the decisions around TPS for the Central American countries, all of this factors in just as much as the decisions that we're making on how to invest in the region to, with the U.S.'s efforts to constrain flows or to cut flows. It ties in very closely, I think, with some of the questions and thinking around strategies of the governments in the Northern Triangle countries on return and reintegration. And I think what we hear is a high level of concern that these countries are not prepared to absorb these numbers of individuals, particularly with very different profiles. We have increasing levels of returns of individuals who are just trying to access their legal right to international protection, who were fleeing and are coming back to the exact same factors that they fled. How do you provide protection in that context? It's a totally different situation for individuals who have been living in this country for 20 years and are entering into contexts in which protection lacks, as in which opportunity lacks, in which there is a mismatch between markets and their abilities and their capabilities, their assets. I think that there has been some progress in trying to facilitate the return of individuals from the U.S. That said, they're highly lacking, and there's a lack of coordination or meaningful articulation that would help people to reinsert into what exists right now. It's highly concerning to us. And the other thing that I would flag that I think we hear of increasingly as a trend is suspicion by those governments that are receiving individuals back into the country's legislation. In El Salvador, for example, where individuals who have been returned have to check in and periodically. The same thing we have been hearing from our partners in Nicaragua, in which individuals who've been returned are treated with suspicion or as if they're criminals, even though they're individuals who should be entitled a right to access international protection and in some cases have been wrongfully turned back.
Can I say one other thing about returns? I mean, the word return wasn't even in the lexicon up until maybe 3 years ago. We spoke about deportations. I mean, and by and large, that's what we are talking about. Meaning people who are forcefully returned to their home country, not because they wanted to, but because, our laws that are so backwards, have been crazy about deporting people. And this is not even Trump. I'm talking about the Obama administration, essentially. But I believe that nothing that is being done so far in the region, and I include Mexico in this, by the way, goes to the level of a really well thought out, carefully put together strategy on how to handle, the people who have been forced back, to these countries. Mexico is by far a more resourceful country than Honduras, El Salvador, or Guatemala. And in Mexico, the program, I think it's called Somos México, if I'm not mistaken, handled by the Instituto Nacional de Migraciones. If you ask them whether they have any clue about what somebody who they attended 6 months ago is doing today, they cannot tell you. Because there is no capacity to follow up, not even 3 months after people were sent back, to Mexico. And that's without addressing the fact that yes, there are now tens of thousands of kids coming especially into Mexico, because Mexico by far is the biggest recipient of deported population when it comes to the education system. Many of these kids don't speak Spanish. And yet, Mexico doesn't have a program to actually handle officially, well-funded, a program to actually accommodate these populations. And the last comment I'll say, the other word that has become very popular is reintegration. And I always say reintegration is kind of an oxymoron, when we're talking about Central America or Mexico, because that suggests that there is a well-oiled machine that is functioning nicely and you just plug back, something to be reintegrated. But that's exactly what did not exist that made so many people leave in the first place. And I don't think that we are anywhere near, of having a system that truly can reintegrate, populations that are coming back.
Well, I'm sorry. They are truly reintegrated into the mess that you
yes,
have.
Yes, into the mess, yes.
That's as mean and crude as it is. It's. Since 2005, if you want to put a number, but you can go back even longer. But the number of deported Central Americans is about 1 million people. And is just a tremendous amount. Even if 1/3, 2/3 of them are among the people who actually have been returning to the U.S., reintegrating into the U.S., you still have a large number of at least 300,000 people who actually stayed in their home countries. And this is going to continue. 25,000 people deported come to each country in Central America every year. The governments haven't done, the government that has done the most has been El Salvador with a $2 million program for retraining or training and micro enterprises. Just do the math, 20,000 divided by 2 million, divided to, it's just not the real thing, but it's what they can do. And this is the problem. El Salvador is a country that is taking more seriously the magnitude of deportations. And they are aware that they just don't know what else to do. This is something that goes beyond Central American governments. It includes the private sector. It also includes the United States. And there is some thought about it, but it cannot be just in micro enterprises because you are just continuing the same pattern. So the situation in Central America is one where you will see more migration going on out of necessity and out of survival. But we do need to have perhaps practical, borrowing the word practical approaches on how to problematize these conventional approaches to development and insecurity in Central America. Just the questioning of political reforms in Central America is something that has to take place more seriously. We were responsible in having Juan Orlando Hernandez in the first place, in the first election, and now in the second election, we're responsible for that. So, we're responsible for the out-migration of these people. When it comes to organized crime networks, well, we're responsible for consuming what could be about 500 tons of cocaine, worth $25 billion at least. So Central America does at least half of the transshipment of that cocaine. Therefore, we're responsible for 10 cartels handling those volumes of cocaine. So those things need to be problematized in Congress more than in the, I would think, in the White House. With that, do you have something else to add, say, comments?
For me, I think I would say just in the context that we've been discussing and some of the political threats and concerns that we've heard voiced about some of these populations, I guess I would want to emphasize that in the context people are facing, where you lack opportunity, where you are being threatened, or you have yourself been targeted in some form of attack or violation, a lot of the people that our network serves make a choice between where you can, the example that I gave around gang recruitment is one example of it, but the young people will tell you, I can join the violence or I can flee. What would you do? And I think this highlights that migration is the option that gives hope, right? The migration is the option that you can take to live honorably and to continue to uphold and honor your own dignity. And so rather than looking at migration as a threat, I think we should look at it as an opportunity and as a right while we are failing to meet the needs of people in their home countries to stay, to remain, and to live a life with dignity.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much to the speakers, and thank you for you attending.